We need to know that it has only been in comparatively recent years that the existence of the one who is commonly referred to as Jesus Christ has been denied. In prior videos that I had uploaded, like the one comparing Egyptian chronology with biblical chronology, I had spoken on the age of enlightenment or the age of the Illuminati. Understand that enlightened is synonymous with illuminated. And I spoke on how Darwinism and the modern teachings of evolution had followed the Enlightenment era. And it was during the Enlightenment era that the so called educated elite had decided to begin taking persons mentioned in the Bible out of historical documents, etc. Like, people were once taught that King Solomon had actually existed as a historical figure, just as they were taught that Alexander the Greek or Alexander the Great had existed. Although the tomb or burial site of Alexander is still questionable, but we still to this day believe that he existed. Now, although I know that Jesus was not the actual name of Yahushua the Messiah, I may refer to him as Jesus in this video, being that this is the name that many of us are more familiar with, and I'm trying to avoid causing confusion. But hopefully, eventually, we will all know and say his name and realize that he is the Messiah, no longer confused. Now, whether or not people believe that Yahshua, aka Jesus Christ, was holy or performed any miracles as stated in the Bible, his existence was not denied. Some believe that he was just this magician or illusionist performing tricks for his followers. And there were many who spoke or wrote about Jesus and his existence, even though they were not Christian and may have had disregard for Jesus. Now, Cornelius Tacitus, who lived from 56 AD to 120 AD, was a Roman orator and public official, and, as described at Encyclopedia Britannica, probably the greatest historian and one of the greatest prose stylists who wrote in the Latin language. Among his works are the Histories concerning the Roman Empire from 69 to 96 AD, and the later Annals, which is a history of the Roman Empire from the reign of Tiberius to that of Nero, the years 14 through 68 AD. And the Annals are an important source for modern understanding of the history of the Roman Empire during the 1st century AD. As stated in Wikipedia, it is Tacitus's final work, and modern historians generally consider it his greatest writing and the pinnacle of Roman historical writing. And in Book 15, Passage 44, it follows description of the 6-day Great Fire of Rome that burned much of Rome in July 64 AD. And there is the references to Christians. Now, Tacitus's Annals have been published and republished in many secular books, but I'm going to read from this 1872 Whitaker Publishing, edited by George Long, M.A. of Trinity College, Cambridge, on page 441, and understand that his writings were in Latin, so I had to do some typing the best that I could in Google Translator, considering that you can't copy and paste the text from these books. And I'm going to read to you what comes up as the English translation of Tacitus's writings, as you can see here. And the translation reads, "Founder of the name Christ was the reign of Tiberius by the procurator Pontius Pilate, undergone the death penalty, and the pernicious superstition was checked for a moment, then broke out again, not only in Judea, the home of the disease, but even in Rome, where all things horrible or shameful in the center and become popular." Of course, it was better translated in 1876 by A.J. Church and W.J. Broadribs, stating, "Christus, or Christ, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. The Annals further states, as translated, accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city as of hatred against mankind. And Cornelius Tacitus, he gives his account of what happened to the one referred to as the Christ. And he continues to speak on Christians who were tortured as supposed criminals. And know that it's also known that the governor Pontius Pilate, he also existed. And there is secular evidence that proves this.
We're looking at another piece of evidence. The Pilates stone is a damaged block, 82 centimeters by 65 centimeters of carved limestone with a partially intact inscription attributed to and mentioning Pontius Pilate, a prefect of the Roman province of Judea from 26 AD to 36 AD. It was discovered at the archaeological site of Caesarea Maritima in 1961. The artifact is particularly significant because it is an archaeological find of an authentic first century Roman inscription mentioning the name Pontius Pilatus. It is contemporary to Pilates' lifetime and accords with what is known of his reported career.
Now, of course, there are going to be the skeptics.
Skeptic Interjection 1. Could Tacitus have taken his information from Christian sources? Answer. Because of his position as a professional historian and not as a commentator, it is more likely that Tacitus referenced government records over Christian testimony. It is also possible Tacitus received some of his information from his friend and fellow secular historian Pliny the Younger. Yet, even if Tacitus referenced some of Pliny's sources, it would be out of his character to have done so without critical investigation. An example of Tacitus criticizing testimony given to him even from his dear friend Pliny is found here in Annals 55. Tacitus distinguishes between confirmed and hearsay accounts almost 70 times in his History. If he felt this account of Jesus was only rumor or folklore, he would have issued his usual disclaimer that this account was unverified, but he did not. Skeptic Interjection 2. Could this passage have been a Christian interpolation or forgery? Answer. Judging by the critical undertones of this passage, it is highly unlikely. Tacitus refers to Christianity as a superstition and an insuppressible mischief. Furthermore, there is not a surviving copy of Tacitus's Annals that does not contain this passage. There is no verifiable evidence of tampering of any kind in this passage. Skeptic Interjection 3. Why is this passage not quoted by the early church fathers? Answer. Due to the condescending nature of Tacitus's testimony, early Christian authors most likely would not have quoted such a source, assuming Tacitus's writings were even available to them. However, our actual answer comes from the context of the passage itself. Nothing in Tacitus's statement mentions anything that was not already common knowledge among Christians. It simply provides evidence of Jesus' existence, which is a topic not debated at this point in history.
Now, Tacitus' Annals would confirm the following: that the one who is today commonly referred to as Jesus the Christ did exist. That Jesus was the original leader whose life and teachings inspired what became the religion of Christianity. However, YAHUSHUA was not of any religion, although a leader. That Jesus was put to death by the order of Pontius Pilate. That the original teachings that were fused into the religion that became Christianity originated in Judea. and that these teachings later spread to Europe or Rome, where the religion of Christianity was concocted. And there is something that we need to understand. The religion that is now referred to as Christianity, that may have had its beginnings in Rome or Europe. And I'm talking Catholicism, I'm talking Christendom, or what has been fused with old paganism. However, the original followers of the Messiah, YAHUSHUA, who was later referred to by the Europeans as Jesus, and YAHUSHUA himself were of Judea, not Europe. So the writings or teachings of the original scriptures did not originate in Europe. Lucian of Samosata, born in 120 AD and died after 180 AD, was a successful Assyrian satirist, rhetorician, and pamphleteer who acquired a Greek literary education and wrote entirely in ancient Greek, and he may have become a traveling lecturer and visited universities throughout the Roman Empire. And you can see here at Wikipedia, it states that Lucian frequently ridiculed superstition, religious practices, and belief in the paranormal. So obviously, he was not a Christian or someone who would support religious beliefs. Lucian criticized Christians through satire, trying to show that Christians are like any other religious or social group and that they can be lampooned and exposed. But despite the criticism and satire, Lucian never denied the existence of the one who many of us today refer to as Christ. In his writings, The Death of Peregrinus, 11-13, Lucian speaks critically of Christians and their choice to follow their leader, the Christ. Now, I'll be reading an English translation in the Works of Lucian, Volume 4, published in 1781 by University of Cambridge Greek professor Thomas Franklin. And in this book, Lucian, who lived in the 2nd century, speaks on the poor Christians in a laughingly manner. And on page 239, he's speaking on Christ and his followers, and he quotes, "In a very short time, he convinced them that they were all boys to him, became their prophet, their leader, grand president, and, in short, all in all to them. He explained and interpreted several of their books, and wrote some himself, insomuch that they looked upon him as their legislator and high priest, nay, almost worshipped him as a god. Their leader, whom they yet adore, was crucified in Palestine for introducing this new sect." And on page 241 he says, "These poor men, it seems, had persuaded themselves that they should be immortal and live forever. They despised death, therefore, and offered up their lives a voluntary sacrifice, being taught by their lawgiver that they are all brethren, and that, quitting our Grecian gods, they must worship their own sophist, who was crucified, and live in obedience to his laws."
Skeptic Interjection 1. Can we consider Lucian's testimony reliable, due to the source being a literary work? Answer. Lucian's comments revolved around historical events. In Lucian's work, The Way to Write History, he openly criticizes his contemporaries, who distort history to flatter their masters or those who fill in historical gaps with their personal conjecture. He writes, "The historian's one task is to tell the thing as it happened. He may nurse some private dislikes, but he will attach far more importance to the public good and set the truth high above his hate. For history, I say again, has this and only this for its own. If a man will start upon it, he must sacrifice to no God but truth. He must neglect all else." Skeptic Interjection 2. Is it possible Lucian received his knowledge from Christian sources, or that this passage is an interpolation or forgery? Answer. Seeing how adamant Lucian was in regards to historical accuracy and critical investigation, our answer is an emphatic no. As to the passage being a Christian forgery, chances are that the reference to Jesus would be far more favorable if this were so. Lucian refers to Jesus only as a man, a lawgiver, and a sage. Human, not divine descriptions. He never once refers to Jesus as a god. Furthermore, there isn't anything in the above statement that reveals what wasn't already known. It merely asserts that Jesus lived, preached, and died. Remember, at this time, Christians were trying to prove Jesus' divinity, not his existence.
Now, Lucian's passage reveals and confirms that the one who is commonly referred to as Jesus did exist, that Jesus was the original leader whose life and teachings inspired what became the religion of Christianity, that Jesus was worshipped by his followers, and that Jesus suffered death by crucifixion. I also want to point out what Lucian stated on the poor men, or those whom they referred to as Christians, being taught by their lawgiver to quit worshiping their Grecian gods, or the pagan gods worshipped by the Grecians and Romans, to worship their own lawgiver. And we know that the Grecian and Roman gods were inspired by or taken from Hamitic or Kemetic deities, i.e., Egyptian deities. So this says that these Christians had a belief system that was separate from the Kemetic or Hamitic religious and spiritual beliefs and teachings. Although you'll have Kemetics today who will tell you that every belief in relation to religion and spirituality goes back to ancient Egypt, and they seem to overlook Babylon. Titus Flavius Josephus, who was originally named Yosef ben Matityahu, or Matthias, was born around 37 AD in Jerusalem, just a few years after the death of Jesus around 33 AD, and Josephus died in 100 AD in Rome. Now, understand that what you're seeing here is an 18th century romanticized engraving of Josephus that appeared in William Whiston's translation of his works. But remember, Josephus was born in Jerusalem. However, I will still use this image that is provided. Now, as described at Wikipedia and Britannica, Josephus was a Romano-Jewish scholar and historian who was born of an aristocratic priestly family in Jerusalem, then part of Roman Judea. And he wrote valuable works on the Jewish revolt of 66 through 70 AD and on earlier Jewish history. His major books are Against Apion, History of the Jewish War, and the Antiquities of the Jews. Now, in the Antiquities of the Jews, Book 18, Chapter 3, Josephus gives testimony of Jesus, and I will be reading his passage from the 1741 publishing, The Genuine Works of Flavius Josephus, the Jewish historian, translated from the original Greek according to Haverkamp's accurate edition by William Whiston, who was an English theologian, historian, mathematician, and a leading figure in the popularization of the ideas of Isaac Newton. Now the passage reads, "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these, and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day." Now understand that there have been two of these passages, and they only differ in the mentioning of Jesus as the Christ and the testimony of him being resurrected and appearing to his followers alive on the third day. Was Josephus convinced that Jesus was the Christ or divine Messiah, or was he sharing the testimonies of Jesus' followers, documenting it as a historian? In this passage here, from William Whiston's 1734 6 dissertations, it reads, At the same time, there was Jesus, a wise man, if yet it be lawful to call him a man. For he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of those who willingly receive the truth. He had many followers, both of the Jews and of the Gentiles. He was believed to be Christ. And when, by the envy of our principal men, Pilate had condemned him to the cross, this notwithstanding, those who had loved him at first persevered, for he appeared to them alive on the third day, as the oracles of the prophets had foretold many of these and wonderful things concerning him. And the sect of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day. Now, in Johann John's History of the Hebrew Commonwealth, published in 1828, on page 426, he explains in a dissertation that the name of Christ was well known at the time when Josephus wrote, and the meaning of the author is, "This was the Christ from whom the numerous sect of Christians are denominated," or like, "This is the Messiah," or "He is the one who they are referring to as the Messiah. And in regards to the testimony of Jesus' resurrection after 3 days, John explains that Josephus here merely relates what the Christians asserted about Jesus appearing to be alive on the third day.
Skeptic Interjection 1. This passage contains proclamations an Orthodox Jew would not make, such as Jesus being the Christ. Answer. In other translations, Greek and Arabic, the suspicious statements contain disclaimers such as Jesus who was believed to be the Christ and it has been reported. This presents the theory that Josephus was recording the beliefs regarding Jesus and not necessarily his personal opinion, as a responsible historian should do. If anything, it could lead to the speculation that Christian authors did not add to the text, but rather edited it by deleting the disclaimers. You should also realize that the earliest versions of Antiquities contain this passage as it is presented in the first case. The objection usually is that the earliest copy is not until the 10th century. However, we do have several citations of this passage by other authors prior to the 10th century. Skeptic Interjection 2. Early Christian authors like Origen and Justin Martyr do not mention this passage in their writings. Answer. I'm not sure what the motive behind this objection is, because Origen does reference the other passage by Josephus, yet critics claim the reference is too late to be reliable. But, for the argument's sake, if we assume this passage did exist in the form most scholars believe it did, the early church fathers might not have felt the need to refer to it. The original passage serves as evidence for the historicity of Jesus, a topic not debated at this point, as the burden of proof revolved around his divinity.
Now, let's consider another passage from Josephus in Antiquities of the Jews, Book 20, Chapter 9. The high priest Ananus, believing that he had found a proper time to exercise his authority, Festus the procurator being dead and Albinus only upon the road, appointed a council of judges, and bringing several before him, among whom was the brother of Jesus, who is called Christ, whose name was James, he accused them of acting against the law and delivered them up to be stoned. But those of the citizens that seemed the most moderate and were concerned to have the law exactly observed were greatly offended and sent to the king Agrippa, entreating him that he would write to Ananus that he should desist from such actions as could not be defended.
Skeptic Interjection 1. Is it possible this passage was a forgery by early Christians? Answer. It must be noted that no copy of Antiquities has ever surfaced without the above text quoted as it is above. Critics are suspicious of the so-called Christ statement, yet this reference, rather than the Christ, shows Josephus was not condoning the belief but simply documenting it. Also, this passage concerns the actions of the priest Ananias. Jesus and James were not even the primary focus of this verse. Lastly, this passage is cited in other early works which attest to its authenticity. Even if we dismiss the disputed works in Josephus's testimonium, we still see he testifies to a number of things in the above two passages.
Josephus's passages give confirmation that Jesus lived in the 1st century AD. Jesus' brother, James, did exist. Jesus was tried and crucified under Pilate. Jesus had many followers and supporters. Jesus was said to have performed miracles. Jesus was believed by many to be the Messiah. Jesus was said to be the founder of Christianity. Now, understand that I do not believe that YAHUSHUA, who is now commonly referred to as Jesus, was the founder of what is now referred to as Christianity or any religion, even though I believe that he is the divine Messiah. I am just repeating what has been documented in passages regarding YAHUSHUA. Also note, in that time, the debate was not about whether or not the one referred to as the Christ existed. This was known even to those who had a great disdain for Christians, just as we know today that Nat Turner had existed. It was about him being divine, of God or godlike, or deserving of persecution or execution. And we know that when they referred to the Christ, they were talking about the one who is commonly today referred to as Jesus. They weren't talking about anyone else, because in the Bible it says that James was the brother of Jesus, as quoted in the passage. And speaking of those who had a great disdain for or hatred of Christians, Pliny the Younger, who lived from around 61 CE to 113 AD, was a Roman governor over Bithynia and Pontus, now in Turkey, and he was an author and administrator who left a collection of private letters that intimately illustrated public and private life in the heyday of the Roman Empire. And he viewed Christianity as a political association that could be potentially harmful to the empire, and its practices was outside the religious practices of Rome. Thus, Pliny the Younger interrogated, persecuted, tortured, and executed Christians, and after accounting how many, or that so many people were being endangered and executed, Pliny the Younger consulted Emperor Trajan, and in his letter to the emperor, he had stated, "This is the method I have followed with those who were brought before me as Christians. I asked them directly if they were Christians. The ones who answered affirmatively, I questioned again with a warning, and yet a third time. Those who persisted, I ordered or led away. Those who denied that they were or ever had been Christians when they swore before me, called on the gods and offered incense and wine to your image, along with images of the gods, and also cursed Christ, which it is said it is impossible to force those who are real Christians to do. I thought worthy to be acquitted. Others, named by an informer, said they had been Christians but now denied it. These all worship both your image and the images of the gods and cursed Christ. They stated that the sum of their guilt or error amounted to this, that they used to gather on a stated day before dawn and sing to Christ as if he were a god, and that they took an oath not to involve themselves in villainy, but rather to commit no theft, no fraud, no adultery, not to break faith, nor to deny money placed with them in trust. Once these things were done, it was their custom to part and return later to eat a meal together innocently, although they stopped this after my edict, in which I, following your mandate, forbade all secret societies. All the more I believed it necessary to find out what was the truth from two servant maids, which were called deaconesses, by means of torture. Nothing more did I find than a disgusting, fanatical superstition." Now, isn't it interesting how people were initially persecuted and killed by the Romans for being quote unquote Christian, yet later people were being persecuted and killed for not accepting and converting to Christianity? Like when you consider the Spanish Inquisition and how the Jews or Black Portuguese were persecuted, killed, and expelled from Iberia for not converting to and embracing Christianity. So obviously, what came out of Rome was not what came out of Judea.
Skeptic interjection 1. How does dying for one's belief verify the actual existence of Jesus? The sincerity of a belief does not necessarily make the belief true. How does this passage specifically confirm a historical Jesus and not just the existence of Christians in Rome? Answer. Pliny states Christians worshipped Christ as if he were a god. This indicates one who would not normally be considered a god, such as a human, who was exalted to divine status. Also, the early Christians would have been in a position to know if Jesus was a historical figure or not. Though critics can claim these martyrs took Jesus' existence solely on faith, common sense tells us that there would have been a lot more evidence of a historical Jesus at this time than what has been preserved until today. According to early historians, Jesus' great-nephew and other relatives were still alive, as well as the associates of the original apostles. Such individuals could easily verify his existence. Also, documents which have been lost to us were still in existence, such as Jesus' trial records and the census records of his birth, and were even referenced by early authors who wrote about Jesus. These individuals had every reason to be certain of Jesus' existence and were willing to die because of it. Skeptic interjection 2. Pliny also states some recanted their testimony. Perhaps they did so because they knew Jesus was a myth. Answer. There are several rational explanations as to why some would recant their Christian beliefs. Pliny readily admits to torturing some of the accused. Are admissions or denials really credible under torture? Also, the accused knew if they did not recant, they would be put to death. Fallible human rationalization, confess and go home, and work out the hard feelings with Jesus later, or suffer crucifixion. Also, some of the accused could have been lackadaisical Christians who half-heartedly accepted Christianity because of a spouse, parent, or friend, and would have had no problem reverting back to paganism upon facing persecution. There were half-hearted Christians 2,000 years ago, just like there are half-hearted Christians today. Just because there were some who may have recanted out of fear or poor judgment doesn't dismiss the deaths of the other individuals who were certain of Jesus' existence and died because they refused to curse him.
Pliny the Younger's letters revealed that Jesus did exist and that Jesus was worshipped as a divine being, although Pliny the Younger believed that Jesus was merely a human being, not deserving of such praise through songs, etc. Celsus was a 2nd century Greek or Roman philosopher and author, writing during a time when Christianity was being persecuted, and we mainly know about his work because the Christian philosopher Origen quoted him at great length in Contra Celsum, or Against Celsus, a refutation written in 248 AD. Celsus is considered the most important pagan intellectual opponent of Christianity before Porphyry of Tyre, and his literary work, On the True Doctrine, a Discourse Against the Christians, written around 175 to 177 AD, is the earliest known comprehensive criticism of Christianity. In Celsus's writings, he blamed Moses for the corruption of the ancient religion, but his harshest criticism was reserved for Christians who, as Celsus stated, walled themselves off and break away from the rest of mankind, and he mimics the exact accusations brought against Jesus by the Pharisees. Celsus's work may be divided as follows: a preface, an attack on Christianity from the point of view of Judaism; an attack on Christianity from the point of view of philosophy; a refutation of Christian teachings in detail; and an appeal to Christians to adopt paganism. In the preface, Celsus forecasts the general plan of his attack by describing in the first place the general character of Christianity, and then proceeding to accuse both Christian and Jew of separatism, that is to say, of arrogating to themselves a superior wisdom. In the second portion, Celsus argues that Christ did not fulfill the messianic expectations of the Hebrew people. Celsus claims that during the course of his public ministry, Jesus could not convince his countrymen that his mission was divine, and as followers, he had 10 or 12 infamous publicans and fishermen. Such is not the company that befits a god. Celsus writes in addressing Christianity, "First, however, I must deal with the matter of Jesus, the so-called Savior, who not long ago taught new doctrines and was thought to be a son of God. This Savior, I shall attempt to show, deceived many and caused them to accept a form of belief harmful to the well-being of mankind. Taking its roots in the lower classes, the religion continues to spread among the vulgar." And Celsus claimed that Christianity thrives in its pure form among the ignorant. Celsus accused Christians of setting up a church that diverted allegiances that should be properly be the state's, and in worshiping a man, Jesus, instead of God or a God, thus building up a mere man at the expense of the gods. And he said that not only were Christians building up a man, Jesus, at the expense of God, but since he was dead, Celsus accused them of blasphemy in worshiping a corpse, acknowledging that Jesus was once a living human being, but Celsus believed that Jesus was merely a human. Celsus does not deny that Jesus performed miracles, but not because he was the Son of God. He claimed that Jesus was a master magician and illusionist trained in Egypt. Celsus denies the virgin birth, claiming that Jesus' mother, Mary, was adulterous, which is also what the Talmud claims, suggesting that Mary was a poor spinner who was married to a carpenter and had committed adultery with a Roman soldier, which Origen considered to be a fabricated story. Celsus claims that when Mary gave birth to her illegitimate son, he went to Egypt and learned magic and prestidigitation. Other people can do similar tricks, so what exactly entitles Jesus thereafter is a mishmash of different traditions, as he stated. In Celsus's writings on the true doctrine, A Discourse Against the Christians, Celsus attacks the Christian doctrines of creation, original sin, redemption, incarnation, and resurrection. He decries the idea that crucifixion, the type of death penalty reserved by the Romans for the lowest class, could be divine. In the fifth and last portion of his work, Celsus invites the Christians to abandon their cult and join the religion of the majority. He defends the worship of idols, the invocation of demons, the celebration of popular feasts, urging, among other considerations, that the Christian who enjoys the bounties of nature ought, in common gratitude, to render thanks to the powers of nature. He concludes his treatise by an appeal to Christians to abandon their vain hope of establishing the rule of Christianity over all the earth. He invites them to give up their life apart and take their place among those who by word and deed and active service contribute to the welfare of the empire. The church's usual tactic for dealing with hostile writings was to ignore them, and this is how the church chose to respond to Celsus, and this was the initial view taken by Origen, but he was encouraged by church leaders to write a response to the views expressed by Celsus because of his claim that no self-respecting philosopher of the Platonic tradition would ever be so stupid as to become a Christian.
Skeptic Interjection 1. Celsus also states, "It is clear to me that the writings of the Christians are a lie, and that your fables are not well enough constructed to conceal this monstrous fiction." So how do we know that Celsus is referring to a historical Jesus and not just debating a myth of Jesus? Answer. There are two very important facts regarding Celsus which make him one of the most important witnesses in this discussion. Though most secular passages are accused of being Christian interpolations, we can accept with certainty that this is not the case with Celsus. The sheer volume of his writings, specifically designed to discredit Christianity, coupled with the hostile accusations presented in his work, dismissed the chance immediately. Also, the idea of Celsus getting his information entirely from Christian sources, another recurring accusation against secular evidence, is wholly absurd. He is obviously aware of his opponent's belief, as anyone who is engaging in a debate should be. Celsus wrote his exposition in a form of dialogue between a, quote, Jewish critic and himself. This gives us cause to believe that he used non-Christian, probably Jewish, sources. Evidence which shows Celsus to be refuting aspects of a historical Jesus is as follows. Number 1. Satisfied with his presentation of evidence, Celsus offers his conclusion that Jesus was only a man, not a myth, or a god, as the apostles had claimed. That's pretty clear that he thought that he existed. On Jesus' miracles, he writes, Jesus, on account of his poverty, was hired out to go to Egypt. While there, he acquired certain magical powers. He returned home highly elated at possessing these powers, and on the strength of them gave himself out to be a god. It was by means of sorcery that he was able to accomplish the wonders which he performed. Let us believe that these cures, or the resurrection, or the feeding of a multitude with a few loaves, these are nothing more than the tricks of jugglers. It is by the names of certain demons and by the use of incantations that the Christians appear to be possessed of miraculous power. Not only does Celsus confirm Jesus' existence here, he also tries to debate the source of his miracles. Like the Pharisees of Jesus' day, Celsus tries to dismiss these miracles as both demonic possession and cheap parlor tricks. However, he is clearly grasping at straws. On one hand, Celsus accuses Jesus of performing magic learned in Egypt, then later states it is by the power of possession, then states the miracles were not really miracles at all, but were illusionary tricks performed by a deceiver, then finally states that the miracles never occurred. Instead of denying the alleged events, Celsus offers alternative theories to the early Christian claims, like the virgin birth being a cover-up for an illegitimate pregnancy, and the miracles actually being the works of sorcery. If he was discussing a mythical character, he would not have needed to go to such lengths, but to merely have dismissed Jesus as a myth. After all, there is no easier way to discredit a religion than to assert its founder never existed. Of course, this is the argument Celsus never makes. Celsus refers to his belief that the claims such as the virgin birth and the resurrection were embellishments created by Christians, not that Jesus himself was a myth. Celsus was debating the claims of Jesus' divinity, not his existence. Celsus confirms Jesus' death by crucifixion, although he claims the only wounds Jesus received were those inflicted by the crucifixion, thus denying any previous torture had taken place. On the crucifixion, Celsus writes, Jesus accordingly exhibited after his death only the appearance of wounds received on the cross, and was not in reality so wounded as he is described to have been. In this statement, Celsus contradicts himself yet again when he later states that Jesus was probably never even crucified, but instead had an impostor die in his place. If he was discussing a mythical character, he would not have needed to go to such lengths, but to merely have dismissed Jesus as a myth. After all, there is no easier way to discredit a religion than to assert its founder never existed. Of course, this is the argument Celsus never makes.
Celsus's passages gives confirmation that Jesus did exist, Jesus' mother Mary did exist, Jesus had 10 or 12 apostles whom Celsus referred to as publicans. Jesus performed acts which were believed to have been miracles. Jesus was believed to be divine by many. Jesus was put to death or crucified. Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus, who was born in North Africa and lived from around 69 AD to sometime after 122 AD, was an antiquarian, historian, and scholar who held administrative positions at the imperial court under the Roman emperors Trajan and Hadrian, and he was an analyst and biographer who wrote during the imperial era of the Roman Empire. Suetonius' most important surviving work, De Vita Caesarum, commonly known as The 12 Caesars, is a set of biographies of 12 successful Roman rulers from Julius Caesar to Domitian. Suetonius records history which corroborates historical evidence of the Bible scriptures at Acts 18, verse 2, which states that Claudius had commanded all Jews to depart from Rome. Claudius refers to the fourth Roman emperor, Tiberius Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, who ruled from 41 to 54 AD. Suetonius also records the expulsion of Jews from Rome and confirms their faith inspired by or influenced by the one referred to as Christ or the Christ in the 12 Caesars. In the biographical section on the life of Emperor Claudius, it reads, "He banished from Rome all the Jews who were continually making disturbances at the instigation of one Chrestus."
Skeptic Interjection 1. Because Suetonius misspells Christus as Crestus, is it possible that he was referring to someone else? Answer. Because Crestus was an actual Greek name, critics speculate Suetonius may have been referring to a specific civil agitator. I would like to present a few arguments as to why I feel this is a reference to Jesus. In order to get as close to the author's intent as possible, this is the passage as it exists in the original Latin. Suetonius seems to imply the word Christus as a title, not as a reference to a particular rebel. Though I have seen critics cite the passage as a certain one, Christus, we can see that this is incorrect by the lack of the original quodam in the original Latin. Suetonius uses the word instigation, not instigator. The Latin word referring to an instigator is impulsor, but the term referring to an instigation is impulsore. And this is the word Suetonius uses, thus affirming the belief that he is using the word Christus as a title and not as a name. It was common for both pagan and Christian authors to spell the name using either an E or an I, and we know that the Christian authors were obviously referring to Jesus when they spelled the name Christus. Tertullian criticizes pagan disdain or hate for Christianity and points out the fact that they can't even spell the name correctly. He implies the common misspelling of Crestius by their use of the term Christians. He writes, "Most people so blindly knock their heads against the hatred of the Christian name, it is wrongly pronounced by you as Christians, for you do not even know accurately the name you hate. But the special ground of dislike to the sect is that it bears the name of its founder." Apology, chapter 3.
Suetonius' documented history confirms that the Bible scripture at Acts 18:2 gives accurate historical information on the Jews being expelled from Rome by Emperor Claudius in the 1st century AD. Jesus obviously had a great influence on the Jews if he was being referred to as an instigator. Jesus inspired the faith of many Jews. Christus or Jesus did exist. Dallas was an early historian and chronologer who wrote in Koine Greek, although he was believed to have been a Samaritan. Dallas is sometimes cited for details on Syrian and Assyrian history and was identified by Eusebius of Caesarea in his chronicle as the author of a brief compendium covering the years from the fall of Troy in 1184 BC to the 167th Olympiad around 109 BC. Most scholars date Thallus' work to around 50 AD, although most of his work has been lost and are in fragments. Some of his writings were quoted by Eusebius of Caesarea, Theophilus of Antioch, and multilingual philosopher Sextus Julius Africanus, who was a traveler and a historian of the late 2nd and early 3rd century. Julius Africanus was considered the father of Christian chronography. He wrote Chronography, A History of the World, in 5 volumes, and he debated Thales' explanation of the midday darkness which occurred during the Passover of the crucifixion of the Christ. The Bible speaks of the Messiah's crucifixion and how darkness came over the land. In Luke 23:44-45, it reads, "It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon, for the sun stopped shining." And Matthew 27:51 speaks of an earthquake. Julius Africanus writes, "On the whole world there pressed a most fearful darkness, and the rocks were rent by an earthquake, and many places in Judea and other districts were thrown down. This darkness, Thales, in the 3rd book of his history, calls, as appears to me without reason, an eclipse of the sun. For the Hebrews celebrate the Passover on the 14th day according to the moon, and the Passion of our Savior falls on the day before the Passover, but an eclipse of the sun takes place only when the moon comes under the sun. And it cannot happen at any other time but in the interval between the first day and the new moon and the last of the old, that is, at their junction. How then should an eclipse be supposed to happen when the moon is almost diametrically opposite the sun?" It also reads that Phlegon of Trials records that in the time of Tiberius Caesar, at full moon, there was this full eclipse of the sun from the 6th hour to the 9th. F. Bruce states in his book, The New Testament Documents, Are They Reliable? Africanus stated his objection to the report, arguing that an eclipse of the sun cannot occur during the full moon, as was the case when Jesus died at Passover time. The force of the reference to Thales is that the circumstances of Jesus' crucifixion were known and discussed in the imperial city as early as the middle of the 1st century. The fact of Jesus' crucifixion must have been fairly well known by that time, to the extent that unbelievers like Thales thought it necessary to explain the matter of the darkness as a natural phenomenon.
Skeptic Interjection 1. Why doesn't Pliny the Elder or Senencia mention this event in their writings? Answer. Pliny focused his writings on natural astronomical events that had physical scientific explanations. It is doubtful that he would have found it necessary to record an event of supernatural origin. I can also find no mention of him being in Judea at the time, so it is doubtful he would have mentioned it if he did not witness the events firsthand. Seneca focused his writings on dramas, dialogues, and tragedy, and like Pliny, it is doubtful he was in Judea during this event. Skeptic Interjection 2. Because Thales' and Phlegon's work exist only in fragments, can their testimonies be considered reliable? Answer. This is something the reader will have to determine on their own. Africanus was an honest, qualified author who did not alter the quotes to serve his own purpose. This is very likely considering what we know about Africanus. Africanus's methods were highly respected by his peers. He was often quoted by other authors. He had even chastised his friend and fellow Christian Origen for citing information from a spurious, unreliable source. It also must be noted that Thales never said this eclipse did not happen, but instead was trying to actually come up with a scientific explanation to the eclipse instead of assigning it to divine origins.
Thales' writings reveal that the Bible scriptures at Luke 23:44 and 45 documented an actual occurrence that prompted explanations and debates. And considering that Africanus gave such a detailed rebuttal to Thales' explanation for the unusual occurrence, this confirms that Jesus was crucified and that he was crucified at the time of the Passover. Mara bar Serapion was a Syriac Stoic philosopher in the Roman province of Syria who wrote a letter to his son from prison after 73 AD, encouraging his son in the pursuit of wisdom, pointing out the bad things that happen to those who persecute wise men. In his letter he wrote, "For what advantage did the Athenians gain by the murder of Socrates, the recompense of which they received in famine and pestilence? Or the people of Samos by the burning of Pythagoras, because in 1 hour their country was entirely covered with sand. Or the Jews by the death of their wise king, because from that same time their kingdom was taken away. For with justice did God make recompense to the wisdom of these three. For the Athenians died of famine, and the Samians were overwhelmed by sea without remedy, and the Jews, desolate and driven from their own kingdom, are scattered through every country. Socrates is not dead because of Plato, neither Pythagoras because of the statue of Juno, nor the wise king because of the laws which he promulgated.
Skeptic Interjection 1. How do we know that this passage is in reference to Jesus? 1. Jesus was a Galilean Jew. 2. He was executed. Jesus was crucified after the Jews appealed to Pilate to have him crucified. 3. After his death, Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed. This occurred in 70 AD, after Jesus' death. 4. The Jews were dispersed after his death. The Jews abandoned Judea after the Roman attack of 70 AD.
And they were taken into captivity from Jerusalem. And from the lands that they migrated to over time.
He was a teacher. Jesus was a rabbi or teacher. He lived on after death, and the teachings founded the Christian faith. He was a wise king. Jesus was mocked by the Romans as the king of the Jews. The messianic prophecies fulfilled by Jesus referred to the coming Messiah as king. Christians believed that Jesus was their spiritual king. Jesus was born of the royal line of King David.
Marabar Serapian's letter confirms that Jesus did exist. Jesus was considered to be wise, considering that he's being grouped with great philosophers like Socrates and Pythagoras. Jesus was a leader, considering that Serapian's referring to him as a king. Jesus was the leader of the Jews. Jesus was executed, which was an act that was seen by Christians and obviously some non-Christians as being an unjust act against him. The Talmud, or the Babylonian Talmud, is an ancient record of Jewish history and is the central text of rabbinic Judaism, religious law, and Jewish theology. The Talmud consists of documents compiled over the period of late antiquity, about the 6th century. Although the Talmud does not accept the one referred to as Jesus as being any sort of divinity, it confirms the belief that Jesus was executed, thus acknowledging his existence, at least as a human. The Talmud passage at Sanhedrin 43a reads, "On the eve of Passover they hanged Yeshua of Nazareth. And the herald went forth for 40 days, saying, Yeshua of Nazareth is going forth to be stoned, in that he hath practiced sorcery, and beguiled and led astray Israel. Let everyone knowing aught in his defense come and plead for him. But they found naught in his defense, and hanged him on the eve of Passover."
Skeptic Interjection 1. How can we know that the Talmud is documenting Jesus' existence and not only stating the rumor surrounding a myth? Answer. In the above excerpt, the Talmud mentions Jesus' ability to perform miracles, but tries to dismiss it as sorcery. If the writers were simply refuting myth, they would most likely have dismissed the tale as a rumor, not assign alternate theories to defend their position. Skeptic Interjection 2. How can we know that this passage is a reference to Jesus and not another individual with the name Yeshu? Answer. Though it is possible this passage could refer to another individual, we know Jesus was killed during the Passover. We know he was crucified, a Jewish idiom for hanged. We know he was accused of practicing sorcery by the Pharisees for his miracles. And he was ultimately arrested for the sin of blasphemy, enticing Israel to apostasy. Furthermore, there are other translations which read Yeshu the Nazarene, which give us even more reason to believe that this passage pertains to Jesus.
The Babylonian Talmud confirms that Yeshua or Jesus did exist. Jesus was a Nazarene. Jesus was accused of practicing sorcery. Jesus was accused of apostasy. Jesus was a leader, being that he was accused of misleading people. And Jesus was executed on the eve of the Passover.
There are many more accounts that refer to Jesus and his existence from the 1st and 2nd century. And this, of course, does not include the many books and letters contained in the New Testament, where even the critics agree it was penned by at least 5 different authors. So we're talking about different letters from different times, claiming to be, in some cases, eyewitness accounts of the historical happenings of the events of this man's life. Some common questions are, why is there no physical evidence or personal writings to verify Jesus' historicity? The Bible has been accused on several occasions of committing historical errors, but has later been proven accurate through archaeological finds. For instance, the Old Testament mentions a tribe of people known as the Hittites. Skeptics pointed out that there was no such civilization in history, yet in the 19th century, records of the Hittites were discovered within Assyrian ruins. Today, we know a lot about the Hittites, such as their language, craftsmanship, geography, and empire chronology. The New Testament mentions the pool of Bathsheba as a place where Jesus healed a paralytic. No such location was known to exist until it was discovered in Jerusalem as a place where the sick would gather to seek healing. Just because an artifact has not yet been recovered does not mean none exists. In regards to personal writings, Socrates, for example, exists only in the writings of his students. There is not a single document still in existence that contains his original works. If we apply the same logic with Socrates, skeptics use to determine Jesus' historicity, we must assume Socrates was a figment of the imagination of his students. But if we are to accept Socrates as a historical figure based on 4 secondary accounts, we must also accept Jesus as a historical figure whose life was documented by his disciples, historians, and those who rejected his divine claims. In conclusion, a lot of evidence has been presented during this discussion to confirm Jesus Christ as a historical figure. We have viewed accounts taken from numerous authors of different theological backgrounds, and we have answered some common skeptic questions concerning Jesus' historicity. I purposely avoided using biblical evidence to support the existence of Jesus because that would be using the Bible to prove the Bible. Instead, we focused this study on extra-biblical sources. However, early Christian historians and witnesses were unanimous in their accounts that several New Testament books were written by eyewitnesses of both Jesus and the apostolic ministries. If these authors were indeed eyewitnesses, we can believe that they also provide evidence to the historicity of Jesus.
And let me share some ancient artwork with you, or what can be referred to as ancient graffiti. Now, this is from historyofinformation.com. The article is titled, Probably the Earliest Surviving Image of the Crucifixion, an Anti-Christian Graffito. The article here reads, the earliest surviving image of the crucifixion appears to be an anti-Christian graffito discovered in 1857, carved in plaster on a wall near the Palatine Hill in Rome, now in the Palatine Antiquarium Museum. A Greek inscription translated as Alexamenos worshiping his god is scratched on the graffito, causing it to be known as the Alexamenos graffito. The date of this graffito has been estimated as between 50 and 250 CE. And let me read a little more detail on this from Wikipedia. The image depicts a human-like figure affixed to a cross and possessing the head of a donkey or mule. In the top right of the image is what has been interpreted as either the Greek letter upsilon or a tall cross. To the left of the image is a young man, apparently intended to represent Alexamenos as a Roman soldier or guard, raising one hand in a gesture, possibly suggesting worship. Also, beneath the cross, there's a caption that's written in crude Greek, and it is believed to be a Greek word which means worship. The full inscription can be read as Alexamenos worships his God. Another inscription in different hand reads, Alexamenos is faithful, or Alexamenos the faithful. And this may be a retort by an unknown party to the mockery of Alexamenos represented in the graffiti. Now, the estimated date of this graffiti is between 50 and 250 AD, and it has been interpreted as being blasphemous. The inscription is usually taken to be a mocking depiction of a Christian in the act of worship.
Well, much like in our own time, comparing someone to a donkey or an ass would have been seen as an insult in ancient Roman society. Pagans found the idea of worshiping a man who had been crucified to be contemptible. Crucifixion was a form of capital punishment and was considered the undignified death of a condemned criminal.
Now, there have been debates on what type of stake, what type of wooden stake that YAHUSHUA HaMashiach, the one now commonly referred to as Jesus Christ, was hanged upon or crucified on, whether it was towel-shaped, like the T, or whether it was just an upright vertical pole or stake, storos. That has been debated, but understand that both have been used in crucifixion. So, regardless, considering how far back this graffiti dates, before the 4th century and as early as the 1st century, this reveals that during this time period, there was the crucifixion of someone who was revered as holy, a deity worthy of worship, who had a great influence on faith and religion. And yet, he was mocked as a human who others saw as not so great. So whether you see him as holy and divine or just human, it cannot be denied that YAHUSHUA HaMashiach, the one who is now commonly referred to as Jesus Christ, did in fact exist.